Hi, this is Justin Coletti. You may know me from Sonic Scoop, but today I'm on the Plugin Alliance channel, and we've got the special privilege today of talking to Mr. Žiga Rezar. He is one of the audio DSP developers at Brainworx, and he's just worked on a really exciting plugin, the TOMO Audiolabs LISA. But something I want to talk to him in even more detail about today is transformer emulations. He has just modeled painstakingly the transformer inside of the TOMO Audiolabs LISA, a beautiful hardware dynamic EQ. And he has, for the first time, created a new control for a Plugin Alliance plugin, and that's a TX drive control, which separately models a transformer and allows you to dial in just how hard you want to drive that transformer. So I'm really curious to pick Žiga's brain not only about the TOMO Audiolabs LISA plugin, a dynamic EQ based on hardware, but also on the role that transformers play in audio design, why they're still so popular to this day in high-end analog audio devices, and why it made sense to emulate one and give you direct control over it now in a Plugin Alliance plugin. Žiga, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, great. Thank you for being here. And let's get right into that first question. First of all, what is an audio transformer? Why do people talk about them so much? They apparently have this kind of magical musical quality that people like to emulate in plugins that make them super popular in high-end analog designs. What kind of role is a transformer playing in a real analog audio device? And why do you think that they're so popular to use in high-end audio devices to this day?
The primary purpose was impedance matching and galvanic isolation. So anything that would go wrong with DC in any part of the signal chain for whatever reason, the transformers would kind of block that disturbance from reaching the insides of any analog unit. But I think that today the biggest value that transformers bring to analog audio equipment is the subtle color that they imprint on the signal that passes through them, because of the various so-called imperfections in the construction or in the way they actually work that we've kind of grown fond of.
Right. So for a certain point in history, transformers were basically necessary to design analog audio hardware, especially in the tube days, also in the early transistor days. But at a certain point, people could start taking them out of circuits, make the circuits less expensive. But it felt like something was missing, some of that color and saturation that you're talking about. Can you describe in both technical and maybe creative terms, what does that saturation, that color that a transformer adds to the signal, what does it sound like? And what are we missing when the transformer goes away?
So if I start with the non-technical artistic part, that's kind of subjective, but at least to me, it's doing two things. First of all, it's taking off the edge of the transients just a little bit, but not in a way that it would make them dull, but it allows them to be as present as before or more with a lower absolute level. For a lower peak value, you get more of a perceived transient. But yeah, it thickens the whole mix up nicely. So it makes the low end sound a little bit more solid with a little bit more impact. And it softens the highs, but make them more present at the same time. It's hard to to put this into exact words.
Right. So there's a kind of a loudening and smoothing effect where we're taking the relative level of the transient to the rest of the audio and kind of reducing it slightly, but it does this in a way without making it dull. Is that because there's also some kind of frequency skewing happening in a transformer as well?
That actually is one way to look at it. And this might be a nice kind of segue into the more technical explanation of what it's actually doing. Is it's a slight transfer of energy from the most loudest part of the spectrum, which is usually the fundamental frequency, into the harmonics that are higher up the spectrum. So you get a little bit less of the fundamental and a little bit more of the harmonics, which then results in the sounds being perceived as more present or brighter, louder, more impactful, and so on.
All right, very cool. So it makes a lot of sense why you'd want to properly emulate a transformer in plugin device. But can you give us a sense for what this TX drive control does? I think by default it starts at the plus 18 setting, but you're able to turn this up or down. And what kind of changes should we expect as we're increasing the new TX drive control? And what kind of changes should we expect while we're decreasing it? And why would you want to increase it or decrease it on a particular signal?
Let me start like this. Transformers come without any knobs on them. So the only way we can kind of get all the the complete palette of sound that they offer, so from almost completely transparent at lower levels to highly saturated or mildly saturated at higher levels, we used to do that by gain staging in the analog world. So you would either send a hotter signal into your analog box, or you would go more conservatively on your levels in your analog chain to get more or less of the effect of the transformer saturation. And because it would be not very user-friendly to expect everyone to gain stage with other plugins to achieve that effect in another plugin, the logical thing to do is to just attach volume controls before and after the transformer model that are inversely proportional. So you effectively send more or less signal into the transformer model in just that part of the model. So you get more or less saturation without affecting any of your other gain staging decisions.
Beautiful. And this is an idea we're already familiar with in Plugin Alliance plugins with the headroom control that's been introduced in recent years that we've seen on more and more of these plugins. The headroom control was in the past driving the entire unit more or less depending where you put the headroom control. But if I understand correctly, this new TX drive control is independent from that headroom control. So if you are driving the headroom control harder, you're not necessarily driving the transformer harder, but then you have a separate control that allows you to choose how hard to drive just that transformer. Is that a correct understanding of it, that they are two completely independent controls?
Yes. For this particular plugin, we decided that it would make sense to decouple the headroom control for the dynamics sections and the headroom control for the transformers. So you don't kind of get into this teeter-totter movement of adjusting headroom, and then you're not happy with the saturation anymore, lower that, and then you go back to the headroom, adjust this a little bit more. I mean, it would take unnecessarily many steps to achieve the perfect balance.
Right, it would make the user experience a lot worse. You're trying to just drive the transformer harder, but you end up increasing the amount of compression you're doing as well. One other thing, correct me if I'm wrong, about the saturation inside of this is there's really two components to the kind of distortion that a transformer is adding. Can you talk about that in a little bit more detail? What's going on under the hood there?
Yeah, so basically that was the whole reason for developing the new transformer model, is that usually the transformers are modeled just as a saturation device. So when the level gets too high, basically it gets slowed down a little bit so it cannot exceed a certain level with a nice round knee that produces nice odd order harmonics when pushed hard. But there is another point or another part to the whole transformer sound, and that's the hysteresis distortion. And that one is much harder to model because of the math behind it. But that one is not level dependent, but much more kind of signal steepness dependent, slew rate dependent. So that one's present even at lower volumes. So that may be the cause of another effect of the subtle transformer magic that we like, and that's bringing all the background detail forward a little bit, because not only the loud parts get saturated or distorted a little bit, but the more silent parts as well.
So that's really interesting. With the way that we conventionally think about saturation and distortion, we think about it as being totally level dependent, where there's almost like a threshold. And we get past that threshold, and we're now starting to round off transients and apply some additional harmonics and saturation. But you're saying that even when the signal is really quiet, a transformer is still going to be applying subtle distortion that's going to bring down the peak slightly and bring up the detail and the sustain slightly, because it's reacting to the speed at which the level changes, regardless of how loud it is. So this component of saturation, the hysteresis distortion, is something that is a lot harder to emulate inside of a plugin?
Yeah, I mean, it's because it's dependent on the steepness of the signal and consequently playing into the memory effect of the transformer core, because the harder you try to move the magnetic domains into the core around, the more they resist that. And basically that requires really nasty discrete time mathematics. For that part, I mean, the effort that went into it was a magnitude more than just emulating saturation.
Well, let's talk now in a little bit more detail about this particular plugin. The TOMO Audiolabs LISA is the first and only hardware dynamic EQ that's fully featured that I know of. Do you know of another hardware dynamic EQ that has all the features that we've come to expect out of dynamic EQs in the plugin world?
I think I know one fairly boutique hardware unit that's also a dynamic EQ, but it does not have a feature set of LISA.
So I think it's safe to say that this is probably the first fully featured dynamic EQ in hardware form, and Plugin Alliance chose to model this one. And it's very different from other digital dynamic EQs out there. A lot of digital dynamic EQs we're used to have a graphical user interface that usually has a frequency response chart on there, and you're moving around little bits on a squiggly line. But this one looks, feels, and responds a lot more like a classic vintage mastering EQ. Can you tell us why would it be interesting in the plugin world to emulate a hardware dynamic EQ? Why not just make a dynamic EQ like all the other companies do it?
Basically, two things. First is this old adage of using your ears. I know that some people don't like hearing that, and I get it, but you make different decisions if you don't look at the squiggly line, and I think that for a lot of people, that's actually an advantage. And I may count myself also part of that camp. The other reason for that is that the behavior of dynamics, so the way the dynamic action is put on the EQ, on the static EQ curve, is completely different in LISA than what we are used to in most of the digital dynamic EQs. So it's not only a very strict emulation of hardware for its own sake, but even if it would come in a form with the squiggly line GUI that you can grab your mouse and drag your points around, it would still make a valid contender for a unique piece, because the behavior of the dynamics is different than your usual dynamic EQ.
Interesting. I think one of the things that I noticed here is that each one of the dynamic circuits in the LISA is based on an opto-compressor, which I don't think is the default you'll find in most dynamic EQs. But do also the bands of the EQs and the bands of the dynamics integrate with one another differently than in a standard dynamic EQ? Is there something about them being in parallel versus being in series that's different than a standard dynamic EQ? What's the relationship between them, and how is that different?
The fact that makes this particular implementation of dynamic EQ so unique is that the volume control does not happen before or after the filter circuit. So it's not separate from the filter circuit itself, but it's wired like square in the middle of the filter circuit. And that makes the filter kind of breathe or dance around. Because the dynamics control element is wired straight in the middle of the filter circuit, the Q value changes as well as the gain when the dynamics get engaged. So at first, at, for example, compression, the Q gets narrower, and at some point in gain reduction level, the gain starts coming down as well. For expansion, kind of the opposite happens. So the skirt or the outer parts of the EQ curve stay put, and the center of the curve gets more and more resonant.
And I think that's possibly what plays into how musical this thing ended up sounding, for lack of a better term, where I was able to push the compression and expansion pretty heavily on each of these bands without feeling like I was hearing the compression too much, because it becomes increasingly targeted right on the frequency spot that you've picked, the more and more compression you're applying. So it really was fun to push to kind of extremes and still hear really usable results out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it takes some time to really grasp how to drive this whole thing, because it's not really, I mean, at least to me, when I first started using it, it was not completely intuitive, because the expansion and compression are kind of the other way around, depending on filter being in either cut or boost mode. So that was the first kind of non-trivial thing to get your head around, but with a little bit of practice or a little bit of playing around and thinking about it and so on, it gets kind of logical. And at the same time, the EQ starts feeling much more powerful just because of that. And yeah, I mean, it's as you said, especially in expansion mode, it's exactly that. It's getting more targeted the more you push it. Yeah, because of the fact that the gain change, because of the dynamic section, actually happens only at the peak of the EQ curve. And for the compression, it's kind of the other way around, and that's why it may sound so transparent, is because most of the compression is, I mean, most of the gain reduction is happening outside of the very peak of your EQ curve. So the peak, at least for, let's say, first third of the gain reduction meter, changes very, very little, point something dB. But the width of the EQ changes considerably. So the more you compress, the more sharp the Q gets of that band. And another point maybe would be that I expected this wiggling Q action of the whole dynamic circuit to be kind of weird, because we are used to hearing this sound if we change the Q really fast on an EQ. I mean, it's a wah-wah effect. So I didn't expect that to actually sound musical, but yeah, it does. It's different than a standard dynamic EQ, and in many cases, it's preferable, at least to my ears.
Right. Yeah, I definitely don't hear any of that kind of wah-wah artifacting when I'm using it. It just feels forgiving is the best word I can use for it. Where, like you said, as you start to boost more with the expander, you're targeting in just to a particular area, so it can really help you just focus on boosting, say, the fundamental of a kick drum, or just boosting a specific point on a bass guitar, a note that might be getting lost, whereas in the compressor, you apply more and more, and it's just focusing in more and more tightly and transparently in that one area you want to compress. So I think those are the two factors that really play in to making this a really forgiving and musical dynamic EQ. One, that whole bandwidth shape that you've been talking about, but also it does come back to having this different type of graphical user interface where you're not looking at the lines dancing around, you're not seeing how extreme your cut or boost looks. So it encourages you, it allows you to say, yeah, you can go ahead and push it a little further. It's going to be okay. It's not giving this immediate visual feedback that you're doing so much to your audio. So it almost gives you a little bit more confidence in allowing yourself to dig in and really be creative and really make some bold choices, but then it's forgiving with you when you're making those bold choices and kind of reeling in your excesses a little bit. So it just, to me, is different than working with another type of dynamic EQ. So I really appreciate the design here and the fact that you guys thought to model this, because it's not something that would have ever occurred to me, modeling a hardware dynamic EQ with a hardware EQ kind of interface. I also understand that this was one of the most difficult plugins to emulate for Brainworx, that it was probably one of the most complex out there. Can you give us a sense of just what went into this compared to emulating an average compressor EQ and what made it such a greater challenge to overcome?
I mean, it's the sheer breadth of features that's in this box. I mean, you have, first of all, two beautiful transformers in it, so it would really be a shame to leave those out, and they are a lot of work to get right. Then you have 6 bands of parallel EQ per channel, and each of those bands has a full-featured optical compressor wired into it. That's calibrated in a different way for each band, so it's not just a copy-paste kind of thing, unfortunately. But yeah, it's adjusted for, let's say, average musical level or pink noise level that's probably going to be hitting that area or that frequency area where a specific filter is positioned at. So modeling all that, I mean, optical compressors are very nonlinear in many aspects. I mean, the gain reduction curve is highly nonlinear. The timing constants are dual in nature, to put it mildly. So, I mean, that was a lot of work in of itself. Then trying to get the algorithm to match the hardware as close as it was originally designed, but with the lowest possible CPU usage we could possibly get away with. So it's very, very careful code optimization. So I know that it's very CPU-heavy plugin compared to others, but considering the fact that a stereo unit is running 4 transformer models and 12 optical compressors and all the filters, and then all the BX features at the same time and metering, yeah, I think we're doing pretty good.
Right. Wow. So it compared to just a standard compression plugin or a standard EQ plugin, I mean, it's doing 4, 6, potentially 12 times as much work. So the fact that you're able to do that in a relatively DSP efficient way is pretty amazing. So wonderful. I really had a lot of fun playing around with this myself. I would encourage anyone listening to this interview to try it out. If you have not tried out this plugin, just go over to plugin-alliance.com where you can try out anything they make for free for 2 weeks. Or if you are a member of the Mega Subscription Bundle, this is now just another tool that's part of your bundle at no extra cost. At the very least, get in there and play around with this new transformer drive control that's going to let you hear the kinds of changes you can make by driving a transformer harder and less hard, and give you a real sense memory for what transformer saturation really sounds like. So it's a beautiful way just to experiment with that. If you don't feel like you can hear the changes the transformers are making yet, I think this is a tool that's going to help you learn that, as well as just being another useful control now as part of this beautiful mastering EQ. I had a lot of fun playing around with it. I hope you guys too. Žiga, I think that Brainworx and Plugin Alliance are lucky to have you as a member of the team. Thanks for making this one. Thanks for the design. And thanks for joining us and telling us a little bit more about the story of the Transformer Drive and of the Lisa.
Yeah, thank you again. And yeah, I wish you all the fun playing around with Lisa. Take your time. It's really worth it. I mean, it's a steep learning curve, but it's a very rewarding one.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks again for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop, this time on the Plugin Alliance channel. See you next time.